He had the proof on the table. 9 months of his wife's secret life. 47 pages she'd written at midnight while he slept upstairs. $3.2 million. A program that was already saving lives and a trap someone had built inside it, designed to destroy everything before anyone found out the truth. He sat in the dark, didn't turn on the lights, didn't eat, just waited for a key in the door, because he knew now, all of it. The building on Peachtree Street, the man she'd been meeting, the smile she wore every morning that had never not once been meant for him. And the worst part, it wasn't what he thought. It was something he never saw coming. The door opened. She stepped inside. And for the first time in 9 years of marriage, neither of them knew what the other was about to say. Deron Webb was not a suspicious man. He needed to say that, needed to believe it. Because what he was doing right now, standing at the bedroom window in his work shirt, one cufflink on, one cufflink off, watching his wife walk to her car was not the behavior of a man who trusted himself. It was 6:47 in the morning. Atlanta was barely awake. The neighborhood was quiet the way only Cascade Heights got quiet, that particular hush of old trees and wide driveways and houses that had been paid for twice over. Birds, sprinklers 2 doors down, the distant sound of someone's garbage truck making its rounds, and Simone. She came out of the front door the way she always did, unhurried, like she had already decided the morning belonged to her. Navy wrap dress, the one that stopped just above her knee. Heels, not the tall ones, the block ones she wore when she knew she'd be on her feet. Hair pressed straight, pulled over one shoulder, catching the early light in a way that made Deron think, not for the first time, that his wife was genuinely unfair to other women. He watched her lock the front door, watched her check her phone, watched her walk down the stone path toward her car. She was almost there when she stopped. No reason. Nothing fell. Nobody called out to her. She just stopped at the end of the path, one hand resting on the hood of her car, and went still. Then she tilted her head back, took a breath, slow and deliberate, like someone about to step onto a stage. And she smiled. Not at anyone, just smiled. To herself. This quiet, private, almost glowing thing that Deron had never seen her wear in 9 years of marriage. Then, she got in the car and drove away. Deron stood at the window for a long time after that. One cufflink on, one off. He knew every smile Simone had. He'd been cataloging them without realizing it for nearly a decade. The smile she gave when she found something genuinely funny, wide, a little undignified. She always tried to cover it with her hand. The smile she wore at other people's dinner parties when she was being polite but bored. The smile from their wedding photos, which he'd always thought looked like relief and joy happening at the same time. The smile she gave him when she was about to ask for something she already knew he'd say yes to. He knew them all. That one was not in his catalog. He stood there trying to figure out why that bothered him so much. It was a smile. His wife was smiling. That was supposed to be good. That was supposed to be the goal. But something about the way she did it, alone, deliberate, turned inward, made it feel like a door closing. Something on the other side of it that he wasn't meant to see. He finally put in the second cufflink and went to work. He was 12 minutes late. He hadn't been late in 4 years. That was 6 months ago. And the smile hadn't stopped. Deron and Simone Webb had been married for 9 years. They lived in a house in Cascade Heights they'd bought 7 years ago, when the neighborhood was still a stretch financially and was now a smart investment by accident. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen. Simone had renovated herself over 2 weekends with an intensity that frightened their contractor. A backyard with a fig tree that produced more figs than 2 people could ever use. No children. That was a choice. Made early, revisited occasionally, and always arrived at the same answer. They'd talked about it honestly, in the way people who actually trust each other can talk about things honestly. And what they found was that neither of them wanted to. Not out of selfishness, or maybe a little out of selfishness, which they'd decided was allowed. They liked their life. They liked the quiet of it. The fig tree and the renovated kitchen and the Saturday mornings that belonged to nobody but them. It was a good marriage. Deron believed that. Still believed it, even now, even standing in a parking lot on Peachtree Street watching his wife walk into a building she had no business being in. But he was getting ahead of himself. The thing about Deron Webb was that he had come from very little and built something out of it, with a precision that bordered on obsessive. His father, James Webb, had been a contractor in Birmingham, not a firm. Just himself and 2 guys he trusted, doing residential work across Jefferson County for 30 years. Honest work, respected work. The kind of work that builds a neighborhood without ever getting credit for it. James Webb had died when Deron was 28 years old, prostate cancer. Stage 3 by the time they found it. They found it late because James hadn't been to a doctor in 6 years. Not because he didn't know better, because every time he thought about it, he did the math, and the math didn't work. No insurance through the jobs he took. The private plans he'd looked at would have eaten a third of what he brought home. So he kept telling himself next year. He was a healthy man. He'd always been healthy. Until he wasn't. Duran had been in the room when the doctor explained the treatment options. He remembered the cost estimates more than anything else the doctor said them. He remembered his father nodding along like he was understanding when what he was actually doing was calculating how much of it Duran would have to cover after James exhausted his savings. Duran was 28. He'd been a CPA for 3 years. He had enough to help, but not enough to fix it. James Webb died 14 months after diagnosis. Duran wore his father's watch every day after that, not as a grief gesture, as a reminder of what it looked like when a man didn't have enough information in time, of what it cost, of why numbers mattered, of why the job he did keeping accounts straight, making sure money went where it was supposed to go, catching the errors before they became disasters was not small work, even when it felt small. The watch was gold, modest, the kind a man bought for himself to mark an occasion and ended up wearing for 30 years. It ran a little fast. Duran had never had it adjusted. His younger brother Wendell had asked him once, years after James died, why he didn't get something new. Treat himself, Duran had said. This is the one thing he had that nobody could take away from him. Wendell didn't ask again, so that was Duran, a man who built careful things, who did not act without information, who had not been late to work in 4 years until the morning he stood at a window watching his wife smile at nothing. The smile started in April. Simone came home one evening in March and mentioned she was transferring to a different unit at Grady Memorial. Better hours, more of what she wanted to be doing. She'd been an RN there for 6 years and she was good at it. Duran had watched her talk about her work with the kind of specificity that told you a person wasn't just doing a job, they were inside it. She said the new hours meant she'd be leaving earlier in the mornings. Duran said that was great, he meant it. And then in April, the smile. He noticed it 3 times before he admitted to himself that he was noticing it. That felt important, the 3 times rule. The first time could be nothing. The second time you were probably reading into things. The third time you had data. He had data. He tried to be rational about it. People changed. 9 years of marriage meant 9 years of someone becoming more fully themselves, and you didn't always see all of it in real time. Maybe Simone had found something at the new unit that lit her up in a way she hadn't expected. Maybe it was a medication change, a new friend, a podcast she'd gotten obsessed with. Maybe he was the problem. Maybe he'd been so inside his own head for so long that he'd stopped knowing how to read his own wife. Maybe, he asked her about it once, carefully. They were at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, both of them doing separate things. He looked up from his laptop and said, "You seem happy lately." Simone looked up. "I am, the new unit?" "Yeah," she smiled, a different smile, the easy one, the one he recognized. "It's good work, I feel like I'm where I should be." He nodded. "Good." And that was it. He went back to his laptop. She went back to whatever she was reading, and he told himself he was satisfied. He was not satisfied. The phone started being face down all the time around May. Not aggressively, she wasn't making a show of it. It was subtle enough that he could have convinced himself it was coincidence if he'd wanted to. He did not want to. He also did not want to be the kind of man who clocked where his wife's phone screen was pointed. He was becoming that man anyway. He could feel it happening and couldn't locate the emergency brake. June. She started buying new clothes. Not a lot, not in any way that was unusual for a woman who had always paid attention to how she dressed. But he noticed dresses he hadn't seen before, heels in a box from a boutique on Ponce, a perfume he didn't recognize sitting on the bathroom counter. He didn't say anything, he told himself it was nothing. July came. The smile was every morning now, without fail. Duran started setting his alarm 15 minutes earlier so he'd be awake when she left. He did not examine this decision closely, he just did it. On a Wednesday morning in late July, he was getting dressed when he realized he'd left his laptop bag downstairs. He went down to get it and noticed Simone still in the driveway, sitting in her car, not starting it, just sitting there, on her phone, smiling. He watched from the doorway for a moment. Then she looked up and he stepped back inside before she could see him. He stood in his own foyer, laptop bag in hand, feeling like a stranger in the house he'd owned for 7 years. She drove away. He walked to his car, and without making a decision, without thinking it through, without doing any of the rational calculation he was known for, he followed her. She drove west, away from Grady Memorial. He stayed 2 cars back. His hands were steady on the wheel, which surprised him because his stomach felt like it was dropping through the floor. He kept thinking, turn around. Any second she'll turn around and head toward the hospital, and this will be me being crazy, and I'll go to work and we'll never speak of this. She did not turn around. She got on I-75 North and took the Midtown exit and drove down Peachtree Street and turned into the parking structure attached to Carter Capital Tower. Deron sat in his car in the street for a moment. Then he found a parking spot a block away, got out, walked to a coffee shop across from the tower. He ordered a coffee he didn't drink, sat by the window. He pulled out his phone and looked up Carter Capital Tower. It was a 40-story building in Midtown Atlanta, Class A office space, home to a mix of finance and tech firms. The anchor tenant was Carter Capital Group. He looked up Carter Capital Group, private equity firm, founded 2009, headquartered in Atlanta. He looked up the founder, Eldridge Carter, 38 years old. A photograph told them. Dark-skinned, well-built, in a suit that probably cost more than Deron's first car. Jaw like it was drawn by someone with an agenda. The kind of man who appeared in Atlanta magazine profiles with headlines like The Quiet Billionaire and Atlanta's Most Influential Dealmaker. Deron looked at the photograph for a long time. He thought about the new perfume, the new dresses, the smile. He set the phone face down on the table. He sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours. He did not check his work email. He did not respond to the text from Wendell asking if they were still on for dinner. He just sat. At 11:38, Simone came out of the building. Eldridge Carter was beside her. She was wearing a deep red dress Deron had never seen before. It crossed at the waist, fell just above the knee, moved the way expensive fabric moves. Her hair was down. She was talking hands expressive, making a point, and Carter was listening the way men listen when they're genuinely interested in what's being said. When she finished, he said something, and she laughed, and in the laughing she put one hand briefly on his forearm, casual, comfortable, like they'd done this 100 times. Deron looked down at his untouched coffee. When he looked up, they'd moved toward a black car at the curb. A driver was holding the door. They got in together. The car drove away. Deron sat for another 10 minutes. Then he paid for the coffee he hadn't drunk and walked back to his own car. He drove home instead of to the office. He sat in his kitchen for 3 hours. The house felt completely different, like it had rearranged itself while he wasn't looking. That evening, Simone came home at 6:20 right on time. She kissed him on the cheek. She smelled like the perfume. She told him about a difficult patient. She had details: the name, the diagnosis, the intervention that worked. She told the story the way she always told stories about work, with that particular combination of clinical precision and genuine care that had always made him proud of her. He listened. He poured her a glass of wine. He asked a follow-up question. And he sat with the knowledge that everything she was saying might be true, and that it didn't matter, because she'd also walked out of a building on Peachtree Street at 11:38 in the morning and gotten into a car with a man he'd never heard her mention. That was the worst part, not the fear of what it was. The knowledge that he didn't have enough information to know what it was. Deron Webb did not operate without information. He made decisions when he had data. Complete data, all the columns filled in. He had a column with nothing in it and it was eating him alive. 3 days later he called his brother. They met at Busy Bee Cafe on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, a spot their father had taken them as kids whenever there was something worth celebrating. The fried chicken was the same as it had always been. The lemonade was the same. The booths had been reupholstered twice, but the layout hadn't changed in 40 years. Some things in Atlanta stayed put, and Busy Bee was one of them. Wendell Webb was a corporate attorney who operated at approximately 150% of his necessary volume at all times. He was 35, sharp, congenitally incapable of letting a sentence land without adding something to it. He had gotten their mother's gift for reading people and their father's complete absence of patience for pretense. Deron told him everything: the smile, the new clothes, the building, Eldridge Carter. Wendell put down his fork. How long? 6 months since the smile. I followed her 3 weeks ago. Okay, Wendell picked up his fork again. Set it down again. You need to hire somebody. No. Deron, I'm not that person. You spent 2 hours in a coffee shop watching your wife leave a building with a man you don't know. Wendell looked at him. You already are that person. The question is whether you're going to do it badly, by yourself, or do it right with somebody who knows what they're doing. Darren looked out the window at MLK Boulevard. A woman was walking by with 2 grocery bags. A man was arguing on his phone outside the barbershop across the street. Normal morning, normal Atlanta. He said, I keep thinking maybe I'm wrong. About what? About what it is. Maybe it's something else. Maybe she has a reason. Then find out what the reason is. And if the reason is what I think it is. Wendell was quiet for a moment. Then at least you'll know. Knowing is better than this. He gestured vaguely at Deron's face. Deron pulled apart a piece of cornbread, put it back down. You want to know what actually scares me? Wendell waited. Not that she's with someone else. He said it slowly, like he was finding the words as he went. I could survive that. I'd be destroyed, but I'd survive it. What scares me is that I might not know my wife. That she's been right next to me for 9 years and there's a whole room in her I've never seen the inside of. He looked at his brother. What does that make me? Wendell didn't have a quick answer for that, which for Wendell was something. It makes you human, he said finally. It makes you a man who married a real person and not a version of her he made up. He picked up his fork. Now call somebody. The man Deron called was named Bird Holloway. Wendell had used him on a case 3 years back, not for anything like this. But he said Bird was the person you called when you needed someone who understood Atlanta and moved through it without anybody noticing. 18 years at APD before he went private, knew the community, didn't gossip. Deron met him at a barber shop on Auburn Avenue that Bird used as an occasional office. Bird Holloway was 61 years old. Built like someone who had once been very strong and hadn't entirely stopped. Gray at the temples. The kind of quiet that came from having seen enough things that most things didn't require comment. Deron told him what he needed. Bird asked a handful of precise questions, wrote nothing down. 5 days later, Bird called. They met again, same place. Bird slid a manila envelope across the table and sat back in his chair and let Deron read. Eldridge Carter had been in a committed relationship with his partner, a man named Jerome, for 8 years. Married for 6. It was not a public fact and Carter protected his privacy around it carefully. But within certain circles in Atlanta it was simply known there was no affair. Deron read that part twice. Then he kept reading. Simona Webb had approached Carter Capital Group 9 months ago with a formal proposal for a community healthcare initiative. She'd requested a meeting through 3 different channels before she got one. When she finally sat across from Eldridge Carter, she'd presented 47 pages of research data, an implementation framework for a program she was calling the Auburn Initiative, a free primary care service for uninsured adults in Atlanta's black neighborhoods, targeting early detection and chronic disease management. Carter had funded it. $3.2 million. Simone had been running it out of Carter Capital's offices 2 days a week for 8 months, while continuing her work at Grady Memorial the other 3. Deron put the report down on the table. He looked at Bird. Deron picked it back up, read it again, slower this time. His wife had spent 8 months building a healthcare program from scratch. She'd written a 47-page proposal. She'd gotten meetings through 3 channels. She'd convinced one of the most powerful men in Atlanta to hand over $3 million, and she had not mentioned a single word of it to him. He set the report down a second time, looked at the wall. There was a photograph on the barbershop wall, Old Atlanta, Auburn Avenue from the 60s, the street full of black-owned businesses and foot traffic and a particular kind of life. He looked at it for a while. Bird said, "There's one more thing." Deron looked at him. "The program is under investigation. Anonymous complaint but with Carter Capital's compliance office. Allegation of financial irregularities. They have 21 days to respond before the board considers freezing the funding." Deron was quiet for a moment. "Is there irregularity?" "I'm not a CPA," Bird said. "That's your department." Deron drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. He didn't go to the office. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, and the financial documents Bird had included sourced legally, through a contact at Carter Capital's legal team, who'd been willing to share what was technically a public compliance filing. He opened the documents, and he started reading. He was a certified public accountant. He had been doing this for 11 years. Numbers were not a language he translated, they were the first language, the one underneath everything else, the one that didn't lie even when the story being told around them was a lie. He read the documents, read them again. There was no fraud. He was confident of that within the first 40 minutes. The money was where it should be, applied to what it was supposed to be applied to, accounted for properly in almost every respect. But almost was doing work in that sentence. There was a documentation gap, a tranche of funding routed through an intermediary LLC that was missing its proper paperwork trail. Not missing in a way that screamed criminal intent. Missing in a way that looked, to someone who didn't read this kind of thing for a living, like it could be mismanagement or concealment. The gap was surgical, specific, created by someone who understood enough about nonprofit accounting structures to know exactly which thread to pull to make something clean look dirty. This was not an accident. Deron sat back. He thought about what Bird had said, anonymous complaint. He thought about who would know enough about nonprofit financial structure to do this precisely, who would have enough proximity to the program, who would have a reason. And then he thought about something Simone had said in passing months ago so briefly that he'd filed it and forgotten it. A comment about her supervisor at Grady, Claudette Simmons. How she'd told people about the Auburn initiative being approved, and there'd been a little celebration in the break room, and nearly everyone had congratulated her. Nearly everyone. Claudette Simmons had looked at her, then looked away. Said nothing. Duran looked at the watch. His father's watch, running 4 minutes fast, gold dulled with years of wearing. He sat with it for a long time. James Webb had died at 60 years old because the system that might have caught his cancer early had been financially out of reach for a man who worked with his hands his whole life and never made enough to protect himself the way other men got to protect themselves. He'd been healthy. He'd been strong. He'd been the kind of man who fixed things for other people for 30 years. It hadn't been enough. Duran had become a CPA because of that. Had built his entire professional identity around the belief that the right numbers in the right places could prevent the kind of loss his family had lived through. If you managed the money correctly, if you kept the accounts honest, if you caught the errors before they cascaded. And now his wife, without telling him a single word, had built the thing his father might have needed. He sat with that for a long time. He did not eat dinner. He made coffee and let it go cold. When Simone came home at 6:15, he was still sitting at the kitchen table. The lights were off. The laptop was closed. The documents were in a neat stack. She came through the door and saw him and stopped. Just stopped. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She reached for the wall switch and turned on the kitchen light, looked at him, then at the stack of papers on the table. Duran, she said, just his name. Come sit down, he said. She put her bag down. She came and sat across from him. She didn't ask what the papers were. She looked at his face instead, and he understood from the way she went still that she already knew this moment had arrived. Maybe she had always known it would. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. The fig tree in the backyard was invisible in the dark. Somewhere down the street, someone was arriving home late, headlights sliding across the wall. Start from the beginning, Duran said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. Simone looked at her hands. Then she looked up at him, and she started talking. She told him about a night 2 years ago. A man she'd seen in the hallway at Grady, 57 years old. She'd checked the chart later. A man named Gerald who'd driven himself to the emergency room from Vine City because he hadn't felt right for weeks, and he didn't have a doctor because he couldn't afford the visit. He'd parked illegally outside because he hadn't wanted to spend the money on the garage. She'd walked past him 3 times that night. He'd been alone every time. She told him about the 4 months after that, the reading she'd done, the data, the scope of what she found, the gap, specific and enormous, in primary care access for uninsured adults in Atlanta's black neighborhoods. Not an abstract gap, names and addresses and ages and diagnoses that came too late. She told him about the proposal, how she'd started writing it without knowing who she was writing it for, how she'd worked on it at the kitchen table late at night while he slept, how she'd gotten up at 5 in the morning some days to revise sections before he woke up. He had been in this house while she was doing all of that. Walking past her, saying good morning, eating dinner with her, he had not known. She told him about the outreach, 8 organizations she'd approached before Carter Capital, 6 rejections, 2 non-responses. She'd refined the proposal each time, made it tighter, made it more specific, made the numbers irrefutable. She told him about the morning she sat across from Eldridge Carter, how her hands had been shaking when she opened the laptop, how she'd made herself breathe evenly, how Carter had read all 47 pages without interrupting her, how when he looked up he'd said quietly, "When can you start?" She stopped talking for a moment. Duran watched her face. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. Quiet, not accusing, just needing to know. Simone was still for a long moment. Because she said, when your father died, you said something. We were sitting in your mother's house afterward, and you said, I remember exactly, you said you were done with things that didn't have guaranteed outcomes. That life was short and you were going to put your energy into things with solid foundations. She looked at him. I remembered that. I've remembered it for 8 years. Duran didn't say anything. I was afraid you'd be sensible, she said. I needed to not be sensible for a while. I needed to try something that might not work, and I couldn't do that with someone being reasonable at me. The kitchen was very quiet. Duran reached into the stack of papers. He pulled out the financial analysis he'd spent 3 hours producing and slid it across the table. I know who filed the complaint, he said, and I know how to prove the program is clean. Simone looked at the papers, then at him. How long have you known about the program? Since this afternoon. She looked at the analysis. You already did all of this. It's what I do. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. She was trying not to cry, he could tell. Simone cried occasionally and felt strongly that it should happen on her own schedule. I owe you an explanation, she said. You owe me a conversation, he said. There's a difference, she nodded. But first, he said, before we talk about any of that, I need to say something. She looked at him. I followed you 3 weeks ago. I sat in a coffee shop on Peachtree for 2 hours and I watched you walk out of that building. He kept his eyes on her. I hired someone to investigate you. I read a report about your marriage before I read a report about your work. He paused. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the whole of it, not just my version. The kitchen light buzzed faintly. Outside, something moved in the fig tree. Simone looked at her husband across the kitchen table, at the watch on his wrist, at the stack of papers between them. I kept something this big from you for 8 months, she said. You did, and you followed me and hired someone. I did. A long moment. We're a mess, she said. Yeah, he said. And she didn't move. Them. And outside, them. Atlanta was settling into the deep quiet of a weeknight. Them. The city still doing what it had always done. Them. Holding every story inside it without judgment. Them. Without record. Them. Without end. Tell me about Auburn Initiative, he said. Tell me all of it. From the beginning. They talked until 2 in the morning. Not arguing. Not the careful version either of them had been rehearsing in their heads. Just talking the way they used to talk when they were newly married, and the night felt long enough to hold everything they needed to say. Simone told him the real version, all of it. Not the proposal she'd pitched to 8 organizations. Not the 47-page document. The version underneath all of that. The reason underneath the reason. Gerald was one person. Atlanta had thousands of Geralds. She'd started researching in her spare time, which became most of her spare time. Which became all of it. The data wasn't hard to find. What was hard was sitting with it. Uninsured adults in Atlanta's black communities were diagnosed with chronic conditions at rates far higher than insured populations, not because they were less healthy, but because by the time diagnosis happened, the disease had been running unchecked for years. Hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, cancers that were treatable at stage 2 and not at stage 4. The system wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what an underfunded, underbuilt system did. It left people out and then treated the consequences. Simone had decided she wanted to build a door. Not fix the whole building, just one door in one city, for people who had been told there was no entrance. The proposal had taken 4 months. She'd written it at the kitchen table after Deron went to sleep. She'd written sections in the car outside Grady before shifts. She'd rewritten the executive summary 6 times. She'd used datasets from the CDC, from Fulton County health reports, from a study out of Morehouse School of Medicine that had been sitting in a public database for 3 years waiting for someone to do something with it. 8 organizations, 6 rejections, 2 silences. She'd refined the proposal each time, made the numbers tighter, made the implementation plan more specific, added an outcome measurement section that took 2 weeks to build from scratch. Then a Spelman alumni contact gave her a name. Eldridge Carter was not the obvious choice. Private equity, not philanthropy. No open application process. Known for being hard to reach and harder to impress them. She'd gotten to him through 3 separate channels over 6 weeks before she got a meeting. She'd shown up in her navy dress and her block heels with 47 pages of research and shaking hands. She'd made herself breathe. She'd presented for 22 minutes without interruption. Carter had read every page. Then he'd looked up and said 4 words. When can you start? Deron listened to all of this without interrupting them. He watched her face while she talked and saw things moving across it, something like relief, something like exhaustion, something like the particular release of a person setting down weight they'd been carrying alone for too long. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. I want to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer it honestly. She waited. When you were writing that proposal at this table, while I was asleep upstairs, did any part of you want to wake me up? She didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. Every night, she said finally, every single night. He nodded slowly. But you didn't, but I didn't. He reached across the table and turned the financial analysis so it faced her. Someone built a trap inside your program, he said. And I think I know who. But before we talk about that, I need to say something first. She looked at him. I knew about this program for 6 hours before you walked through that door tonight, he said. In 6 hours I built an analysis that proves your financials are clean and identifies the source of the problem. He paused. I could have done this in September. I could have done it in October. I could have been doing this beside you from the beginning. The kitchen light was very quiet. I know, she said. No, he said. I don't think you do. Because what you thought was that I'd have told you to be sensible, and maybe you were right about the man I was a year ago. But what you missed is what we lost. 8 months, Simone. 8 months we could have been doing this together. She pressed her lips together. We lost time, he said. Not accusatory, just true. And true things had a weight that accusations didn't. She nodded once. They sat with that. Outside, the fig tree moved in a light wind. The neighborhood was completely silent. That deep 2 in the morning silence that makes everything feel more permanent than it is. Tell me what you know, Simone said. So he told her. The next morning, Duran called Bird Holloway before 7. I need the full compliance filing, he said. Every page. Already sent. 6:45. Bird had anticipated the call, which meant Bird was exactly as good as Wendell had said. Duran spent the morning at his home office with the documents spread across the desk. He built a spreadsheet, then another. Then a third that cross-referenced the first two against the LLC registration records Bird had pulled, and the Carter Capital compliance filing that had been submitted as part of the investigation, a public document, obtained through entirely legitimate channels, which Bird had flagged specifically because he knew Duran would need it. Bird's report had included one detail that was going to matter: Nia Okafor listed as a Carter Capital Senior Program Liaison and identified in the filing as a point of contact for the Auburn Initiative's operational coordination. Spellman, class of 2013. Duran recognized the name. Simone had mentioned her years ago, something about a friend from college who'd landed somewhere in finance. He hadn't retained more than that. He retained it now. The picture that emerged from the documents was precise. The Auburn Initiative's funding structure was legitimate in every meaningful respect. Carter Capital had moved the money correctly. Simone's team had applied it correctly. The program's operational accounts were clean. The reporting was accurate. But there wasn't LLC technically legal, registered in Georgia 14 months ago, that had been used as a pass-through for one tranche of the funding. The LLC had no other activity. It existed, as far as Darren could tell, for the sole purpose of creating one ambiguous transaction in an otherwise clean record. Ambiguous enough to flag in a compliance review. Not ambiguous enough to hold up to scrutiny from someone who actually knew what they were looking at. This was not incompetence. This was not an accident. This was someone who understood enough about non-profit accounting structures to know exactly which thread to pull to make something clean look dirty, and not enough to cover their tracks completely. Because the LLC had been registered with a secondary contact field. And in that field, someone had entered a work email address without thinking twice about it. A Grady Memorial Hospital email address. Duran looked at the name attached to it for a long moment. Claudette Simmons. He sat with it, turned it over, let it settle. Then he thought about what Simone had told him the night before, working through everything she'd said, looking for the detail that now fit differently. She'd mentioned her supervisor at Grady once briefly, in the middle of talking about the early days of the program. How she'd told people about the Auburn Initiative being approved, and there'd been a small celebration in the break room. Nearly everyone had said something warm, nearly everyone. Claudette Simmons had looked at her, then looked away, said nothing. At the time, Simone had moved past it. It was a small thing, one person, one moment. She'd had 46 other people being supportive, and she wasn't going to let one silent supervisor dim what she'd built. But Duran held that detail now alongside the LLC registration and the compliance complaint and the surgical precision of the gap in the documentation. And he understood exactly what he was looking at. He called Wendell. He said, "On my bill," said. No questions. That was the thing about Wendell, whatever else he was, he showed up. Wendell arrived 40 minutes later with coffee he hadn't been asked to bring, and an expression that said he'd already guessed this was going to be complicated. He sat down. Duran laid out everything: the documents, the spreadsheet, the LLC registration, the email address. Wendell read without speaking. Duran watched the second hand on the wall clock make 2 full rotations, then Wendell put the papers down. "You have everything you need to take this directly to Carter's legal team," he said today. "You could have this resolved before the weekend, I know, but you're not going to do that. Not yet." Wendell looked at him. "I want to meet her first." A pause. Duran. "She's not a criminal," he said. "She's someone who was scared. And if I skip the step where I find out what she was scared of, I might solve this week's problem in a way that creates next year's problem." Wendell stared at him for a moment. "You are the most inconveniently principled person I have ever met in my life. Thank you." That was not a compliment, I know. Wendell picked up his coffee, looked out the window at the backyard, the fig tree catching the morning light. "All right," he said finally. "Let me draft the outreach. Something formal enough that she understands the stakes. Informal enough that she doesn't lawyer up before she hears what you actually want." "That's exactly right. I know it's exactly right. I'm a lawyer." Wendell opened his briefcase, and Duran, "Whatever she tells you, however scared she was, the program still almost went under. That's real. Don't let the conversation get so understanding that you lose sight of that." "I won't," Duran said. "But I want to understand it before I decide what real means." There was one more thing Duran needed to do before the meeting. Bird had given him 21 days as the window Carter Capital had to respond to the compliance complaint before the board considered freezing the funding. That window had opened 16 days ago, which meant 5 days remained. 5 days to present the analysis, close the complaint, and prevent the program from losing its funding during what would have been the most destabilizing moment of its short existence. Deron called Eldridge Carter's office directly, not through the compliance team, not through a third party. He called the main line, gave his name, explained that he was reaching out on behalf of the Auburn Initiative with time-sensitive financial documentation, and asked for the earliest available slot with the compliance and legal team. The assistant called back in 40 minutes. Thursday, 10 a.m., 4 days inside the window. Deron exhaled slowly. Then he went back to the spreadsheet and kept working. Claudette Simmons agreed to meet. Wendell's letter had gone out Tuesday afternoon. Her response came back Wednesday morning, 8:47, before Grady's day shift was fully underway. She asked for a neutral location. They offered Wendell's conference room downtown. She accepted without negotiating. She arrived 5 minutes early. Deron had spent time thinking about who she was before she walked through the door. Not investigation, just the kind of thinking you did when you wanted to understand someone before you sat across from them. 22 years at Grady Memorial. Nursing supervisor, a federal grant program she'd been running for 9 years, serving 200 uninsured adults annually. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing that got you recognized at annual galas or profiled in the hospital newsletter. The kind of work that required sustained, unglamorous attention year after year, fighting for the same funding renewal cycle after cycle, watching the people in your program get older and sicker while the budget held still. She walked in wearing a dark blazer. No Grady badge, she'd come straight from home, not the hospital, which told him something about how seriously she'd taken this meeting. She was tall, natural hair, close cropped. She looked like someone who had been carrying something for a while and was tired of the weight of it. She sat down across from Deron and Wendell. She looked at Deron. "You're her husband," she said. "I am. Are you here as her husband or as a CPA?" "Both," he said. "But today I want to start by listening." Something shifted slightly in her expression, like she'd prepared for a different kind of room. She put her hands flat on the table. She told them about a departmental memo she'd received in February. A preliminary notice about a new partnership between Grady and Carter Capital. The memo was vague, internal communications usually were, but it contained a phrase that had stopped her cold. Redirected community funding. She'd read it 3 times. She ran a federal grant program. Federal grants came with conditions about matching funds, about institutional partnerships, about how external money moved through a hospital's financial ecosystem. If Carter Capital funding entered Grady's community program structure through the wrong channels, it could trigger a compliance review of her grant, could create a conflict that took months to resolve them, could, in the worst-case reading of the regulations, put her program's next renewal cycle at risk. 200 people, 9 years of care, at risk while bureaucracies sorted themselves out. She had tried to raise the concern through official channels, an email to the hospital's partnership coordinator in February, another in March, a meeting request in April that got postponed twice and was never rescheduled, a follow-up in May that received a 3-sentence response telling her the matter was under review. Nobody at Grady had given her a real answer. She'd spent 6 months watching the Auburn Initiative grow, watching Simone build something that Claudette had decided, through a combination of incomplete information and escalating fear, was going to undo what she'd spent nearly a decade constructing, while her emails went unanswered and her grant renewal crept closer. And so she'd done something she could not undo. She stopped talking. The conference room held the silence, said the LLC. She held his gaze. "I'm not going to insult you by denying it. I appreciate that. I want to be clear about what I intended," she said. "I was not trying to destroy the program. I was trying to create enough of a pause that someone would finally answer my question. I thought if the compliance team opened a review, the partnership coordinator would have to respond, would have to clarify whether my concern was real." She stopped. I didn't think about what the pause would cost while it was happening. Deron was quiet for a moment. Wendell, to his credit, stayed still. "People who needed appointments didn't get them," Deron said. "Not an accusation, a fact." "I know that," she said. "I've thought about very little else for the past 2 weeks." He believed her. He wasn't sure he was supposed to believe her this quickly, but he did. Because he recognized something in the way she was sitting straight-backed, no deflection, absorbing the weight of what she'd done without trying to redistribute it. That was not the posture of someone who thought they'd been clever. That was the posture of someone who had been wrong and knew it, and was choosing to sit with it rather than run from it. "Can I show you something?" he said. He opened the laptop. He turned it to face her. On the screen was a document he'd built the previous night. 2 programs mapped side by side. Auburn Initiative and the Grady Federal Grant. Revenue streams, expenditure categories, compliance requirements laid out in parallel columns. He'd spent 4 hours on it. What it showed, without ambiguity, was that the two programs served non-overlapping populations and drew from non-overlapping funding sources. There was no conflict. The regulatory concern Claudette had identified was based on a preliminary partnership structure, the one described in the February memo that had been revised in March. The revision had eliminated the potential compliance issue entirely. The revision had never been communicated to Claudette. She had been fighting a problem that was resolved 4 months before she filed the complaint. She read the document all the way through, no rushing them. Daron watched her face while she read and saw the moment she understood what she was looking at. The exact moment. Something moved through her expression that was part relief and part something harder to name, the particular feeling of discovering that the thing you did terrible damage over was never actually the threat you thought it was. She looked up. This was already resolved, she said. In March, Daron said. The partnership coordinator revised the structure specifically to avoid the compliance conflict you were concerned about. Nobody communicated the revision to your department. She sat back. He let her have the silence. So I filed a complaint about a problem that didn't exist, she said, because nobody told me it had been fixed. You filed a complaint based on the information you had, he said, which was incomplete. Because the people responsible for completing it didn't do their job. She looked at him for a moment, like she was trying to figure out what he wanted from this conversation. I still built the LLC, she said. I still filed the complaint. Incomplete information doesn't make that right. No, he said, it doesn't. Then what are you asking me for? Daron closed the laptop. Thursday morning at 10, he said, I'm meeting with Carter Capital's legal team to present this analysis and formally close the complaint. What I'd like is for you to be in that room, not as the person who filed it, as the person who can explain what the actual concern was and confirm that this document resolves it. She studied him. You could present that analysis without me, she said. You have everything you need. I could, he said, but if I close this complaint without you, the story becomes, Simone's husband fixed a problem caused by a disgruntled supervisor. That story follows you at Grady. It follows the Auburn Initiative too, because anytime someone wants to question the program, they'll find the complaint in the record, and they won't find your voice explaining what actually happened. He paused. Your voice in that room matters, for you, and for the program you tried to slow down. A long silence. Claudette looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked up. I'll need until tomorrow morning to decide, she said. You have it. She stood, picked up her bag, started toward the door. Then she stopped. Your wife, she said without turning around, what she built. I've looked at the actual program. Not the program itself. She was quiet for a moment. It's real work. The kind that's hard to do and easy to ignore. Now she turned. Looked at Daron directly. I should have gone and talked to her in February instead of sending emails to a coordinator who wasn't going to answer them. Probably, Daron said. I was protecting my people. I know. That doesn't make it right. No, he said. But it makes it human. She left. Wendell waited until the elevator closed. Then he turned to his brother with an expression that sat somewhere between professional admiration and genuine bewilderment. How did you know she'd respond to that approach? He said. I didn't, Daron said. I just knew the other approach wasn't right. Wendell picked up his briefcase. Dad would have done exactly what you just did. Daron looked at him. He would have, Wendell said simply, and then he would have been annoyed it took so long. They walked to the elevator together. Outside, Atlanta was doing what it did in the middle of a Wednesday, moving. Indifferent. Holding its million stories without comment. Claudette called at 8:15 the following evening. Daron was in his home office. Not at the kitchen table. He'd moved his work to the desk after 2 consecutive nights at the kitchen table had started to feel like the only room in the house. The lamp was on, the window was dark. The expansion framework he'd been building was open on the screen alongside the Thursday presentation materials. He picked up on the second ring. I'll be there at 10, she said. I'll let the team know. A pause. One condition, she said. He waited. I want to speak first, before you present the analysis. I want to explain what I was trying to do before anyone sees what I actually did. He thought about that for a moment. That's a reasonable ask, he said. It's not an ask, she said. It's a condition. All right, he said. You speak first. Another pause. Shorter. Tell your wife, she said. Then she hung up. Daron set the phone down on the desk, looked at it for a moment. Then he walked down the hall to the bedroom where Simone was reading. She always read before sleep. Always had them. One of the first things he'd learned about her when they were dating, and he stood in the doorway and said, Thursday. She's coming in. Simone lowered her book. She looked at him with an expression he'd seen before. The one she wore when something she'd been bracing for didn't land as hard as she'd expected. Not relief exactly, steadier than relief. She wants to speak first, he said. Before the analysis. Her condition. Simone was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. I told her yes. Good. He came and sat on the edge of the bed. She set her book down entirely. I want to be in that room, she said. I know you do. I won't say anything. He looked at her. I won't say anything that isn't necessary, she amended. I'll be very measured, she said. Very professional. I believe you, he said. You can come. She picked her book back up, then set it back down. Daron. Yeah. What you're doing, the way you're handling this. She looked at him. It's not what I expected. What did you expect? I expected you to fix the numbers and consider it handled. He thought about that. The numbers are part of it, he said. But they're not the whole thing. I know, she said. That's what I mean. She picked up her book. He stayed sitting on the edge of the bed for a moment. The lamp made a warm circle. Outside, the street was quiet. After a while, he said, Can I see what you're reading? She turned the cover toward him. A novel, not something he'd heard of. The kind of thing she found on her own and never recommended to him because she'd long ago decided he wouldn't read it. Is it good? He said. Very good. Tell me about it. Surprised. And then slowly. The particular smile appeared, not the mysterious one. Not the grateful one. But the specific smile of a woman who has been asked about something she loves and intends to answer thoroughly. She started talking. He listened. The Thursday meeting lasted 90 minutes. Claudette spoke first, as agreed. She was precise and unsparing about the February memo, about the unanswered emails, about the decision she'd made and why, and about the part that had nothing to do with Simone and everything to do with 9 years of fighting for funding that nobody applauded, and everybody assumed would always be there. She did not ask for sympathy. She laid out facts and she named her own errors inside them. Carter's legal team asked 4 questions. She answered all 4 without hedging. Then Daron presented the analysis, the side-by-side structure, the compliance requirements, the March revision. The timeline that showed the complaint had been filed against a problem that had already been resolved and never communicated. When he finished, Carter looked at the compliance director beside him. Why wasn't the March revision sent to Grady's department supervisors? The compliance director looked at her notes. It appears it was treated as an internal update. It wasn't flagged for external communication. That's our gap, Carter said, not defensively, just naming it. He looked at Claudette. The program you run at Grady, how many people does it serve annually? 200. Uninsured adults, primarily over 50 in 6 zip codes. Carter nodded. What would it take for our programs to stop operating like they're competing for the same air? Claudette looked at him steadily. A conversations between our teams, 8 months ago. Then we have it now, Carter said. He looked at his compliance director. Schedule it. This week. And that was it. Not a confrontation, not a scene. Just a room full of people who had been working around each other, deciding some effort and some cost to work with each other instead. The complaint was formally withdrawn. The compliance review was closed pending a final written confirmation which Wendell would draft and both parties would sign before end of day. The program was safe. In the elevator going down, Simone stood very still beside Daron. Claudette was 2 floors above, still in conversation with Carter's team. Wendell was on his phone, already drafting. At the 14th floor, Simone reached over and took Daron's hand. He held it. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. At the lobby, Wendell put his phone in his pocket and said, Lunch. It's 12:15, Daron said. Correct, that's when lunch happens. They went to Busy Bee. Same booth as before. Same lemonade, same light through the same windows falling across the same worn table. The chicken was the same as it had always been, which was the point of Busy Bee, which was something Simone had claimed not to understand for 4 years while consistently eating most of her plate and half of whoever's was nearest. She ate most of her plate and half of Daron's. He let her. Wendell watched this happen with the air of a man who had something to say and was choosing, with visible effort, not to say it. They talked about other things. A case Wendell was closing. Something in the news. A memory Daron had of their father bringing them here after the one Little League season Wendell had lasted before deciding baseball was not for him. The specific humiliation of Wendell's batting average. The way James Webb had ordered pie afterward anyway, and said nothing about the game at all. Just sat there with his sons eating pie on a Wednesday afternoon like the afternoon was its own reason. Simone listened to this story with the attention she gave things that mattered. He sounds like someone who knew what counted, she said. He did, Daron said. Eventually, an hour later, back in Daron's home office with their laptops open and the afternoon light moving across the floor, Simone looked up from the operational projections she'd been reviewing and said, Can I see the expansion framework? He turned his screen. She read it. Slowly, all the way through. The 3-year projection?
Staffing model?
The secondary funding structure. The outcome measurement framework he'd adapted from the Morehouse study she'd cited in her original proposal. When she looked up, her expression was doing the thing it did when she was holding something large. "You built this for the program," she said. "I built it because the program needed it," he said. "When did you sleep?" "I'll sleep later." She looked at the screen again. "The year 2 staffing projection is optimistic. It's achievable with the right hire. We'd need to find the right hire." "We," said. She looked at him. "We," she said back. Outside, the afternoon was settling into early evening. The fig tree was catching the last of the light. The way it did in October when the angle changed and everything turned gold for about 45 minutes before the dark came. Duran looked at his watch. 4 minutes fast, same as always. He had 5 days left in the window Carter Capital had given them. Now he had none. The complaint was closed. The program was intact. The 247 people on Simone's current roster would keep their appointments. The ones who hadn't been able to get through during the review period would get rescheduled. None of that fixed what the delay had cost. Some of them had waited longer than they should have. That was real. That would remain real. But the door was open again. And what came next was the work. He turned back to his screen. Simone turned back to hers. The fig tree held the last of the light for a little while longer. Then the dark came. The way it always did. And the lamps came on in the house. And in Cascade Heights on a Thursday evening in October. 2 people sat in a room together and built something. 3 weeks after the meeting at Carter Capital, the Auburn Initiative Compliance Review was formally closed. The board issued a finding that the financial records were clean, the documentation concerns had been addressed, and the program was cleared to continue operating at full capacity. Deron got the call at 9 in the morning. He was at his desk at the firm in the middle of reviewing quarterly projections for a client. He put down the projections, read the email twice. Then he called Simone. She picked up on the first ring. "I know," she said. "You already know? Ades emailed me 20 minutes ago. I've been waiting for you to call. Why didn't you call me?" "Because," she said, "I wanted to hear your voice when you found out. Not before." He sat with that for a moment. "Simone, yes, we're going to talk more about the communication thing."
I know, not today. Definitely not today, but...
"I know," she said. "Deron."
Yeah, thank you.
He looked out his office window at Midtown Atlanta, the city in the middle of its Tuesday, indifferent and alive. "Don't thank me," he said. "Build it bigger." She laughed, that real laugh. The one she never managed to cover in time. The launch event for the Auburn Initiative was Simone's idea. Not a gala. She was specific about that. Not a fundraiser, not a press event. Something for the community the program served. A recognition of what had been built and by whom and for whom. She chose Ebenezer AME on Auburn Avenue. It was a logical choice in every practical sense: the space, the location, the relationship the church had with the neighborhoods the program served. But it was also more than practical. Ebenezer AME was the church where Martin Luther King Sr. had preached, where the movement had held meetings in rooms that still carried the weight of what had been decided in them, where Auburn Avenue itself understood what it meant to build something under pressure. Simone knew what she was doing. The event was on a Saturday evening in November. Atlanta had finally committed to fall. The trees on Auburn Avenue were amber and rust. The air had the particular quality of a southern autumn, still warm enough to stand in without a coat, if you didn't mind, cold enough to remind you that the year was moving. Inside Ebenezer, the main hall had been arranged simply, chairs in rows, a low stage. On the wall to the right, a mounted display photographs from the first 8 months of the Auburn Initiative's operation, the clinic space on Auburn Avenue staff. Patients who had consented to be photographed. Charts that translated to people the 247 adults who had received primary care in the program's first year. Diagnosis made. Treatments started. Follow-up scheduled. 247. Duran stood in front of the display for a long time before people started arriving. He read the numbers. He read them as a CPA reads numbers, not abstractly but materially. Each one was a cost that had been covered, a barrier that had been removed, a version of his father's story that had gone differently. Wendell found him standing there. "You keep staring at that wall," Wendell said.
I know.
"You built part of that wall. Simone built the wall, you built the part that holds it up." Duran looked at the photograph closest to him. An older man, maybe 65, sitting in a clinic chair reading something, not looking at the camera, just present, just there getting care. "Dad would have been 66 this year," Duran said. Wendell stood beside him. "Yeah," Wendell said, "if this had existed, in Birmingham, when he was 55. I know, we don't know what would have happened. Maybe the same, maybe not, Wendell said. They stood there for a moment. 2 sons doing the math that sons of fathers like James Webb always eventually did. The math that didn't have a clean answer, that never would. but that you did anyway, because the doing of it was part of honoring the loss. He would have liked her, you know, Wendell said. He would have been terrified of her. Same thing with Dad. Deron almost laughed. Almost. He pressed his fingers against the watch instead. The smooth, worn back of it, the old habit. People were beginning to arrive now. Community members, Grady staff, Carter Capital employees, a few city council representatives who Simone had pointedly not centered the event around, but who had shown up anyway because the Auburn initiative had become something worth being seen at. Claudette Simmons arrived with 3 members of her Grady team. Simone saw her across the room. Deron watched. Simone's? The decision happened in real time on his wife's face, a small adjustment. Something settling, something choosing. She crossed the room. He didn't follow. This one wasn't his. He watched from a distance as Simone and Claudette stood together near the entrance. He couldn't hear what was said. It didn't last long. But at the end of it, Claudette put her hand briefly on Simone's arm, and Simone nodded, and they went their separate ways into the room. Not friends, maybe not ever friends, but something that could work. Eldridge Carter arrived with Jerome. This was not the plan. Or at least not a plan Deron had been briefed on. Carter had apparently decided that this was the kind of event he attended as himself and not as a professional representation of Carter Capital Group. Jerome was quieter than Carter, warmer in the way he moved through a room, stopping to talk, asking questions, genuinely interested. He shook Deron's hand and said, "She's remarkable, your wife." Eldridge talked about her proposal for a month. "She didn't tell me about any of it," Deron said. Jerome looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had heard things from the other side. "She told Eldridge she was afraid you'd be sensible. My brother used the same word. It seemed to mean something different when she said it." Jerome tilted his head slightly. She said it like it was a quality she relied on, and was also sometimes hiding from. Deron thought about that, and relying on it, both true at the same time. "She was right to rely on it," Jerome said simply. Then someone called his name across the room and he smiled and moved on. Deron stood there for a moment with that. The program started at 7. A woman from the church welcomed the room. A city council member said a few words that were gracious and brief, which Deron respected. Nia Okafor spoke about the operational work, the logistics, the staff, the clinic on Auburn Avenue that had gone from an empty room to a functioning primary care facility in 7 months. Then Simone. She walked to the low stage in her burgundy dress, gold earrings catching the light. She didn't have notes. She never had notes when she was speaking about something she actually knew. She talked about Gerald, not with his last name. With his permission, she said. She was going to tell the story that had started all of this. A man in a hallway, late at night, alone, a parking ticket accumulating on his windshield outside because he hadn't wanted to spend the money on the garage. She told it simply. No drama, no performance, just the story. She said that she'd thought about Gerald for 3 months. She said she hadn't known what to do with that. She said she'd eventually decided that thinking about something for 3 months was probably information. Light laughter from the room, knowing laughter. The kind that meant people recognized themselves in it. She talked about the work, the proposal, the rejections, the persistence, them. She was honest about the fear, the part where she hadn't known if it would work, and had been too scared to let anyone she loved see her trying something that might fail. She paused there, looked at Deron. He held her gaze. "I kept this from my husband for 8 months, she said, and he found out anyway." Small laughter again. Them. And instead of being hurt, which he had every right to be, he spent 3 hours building a financial analysis that saved the program. She didn't look away from Deron. And then he spent 2 weeks building a 3-year expansion framework that I didn't ask for and didn't know I needed until I saw it. The room was quiet. "That's what it looks like," she said, "when someone actually partners with you. Not when they protect you, when they trust you enough to work beside you." She let that sit for a moment. Then, 247 people received care this year who wouldn't have otherwise. That number is what this room is about. Not me. Not Carter Capital. Not anyone who's going to get up and speak tonight. She looked at the wall of photographs. That number, and the people inside it. She stepped back from the stage. The room applauded. Deron was applauding with everyone else and also doing something he hadn't done in a long time. Which was feeling something without trying to account for it first. Just letting it be there. The pride, the grief, the 9 years and the 8 months and the 3 hours at the kitchen table and the 4 minutes the watch ran fast. All of it present at the same time. Then Wendell leaned over and said, "You're up." He looked at his brother. "Nobody told me I was speaking. Simone told me to tell you. 3 days ago, I forgot. Wendell, you'll be fine. Go." He wasn't fine. He was the furthest from fine. He was a man who gave presentations to corporate boards for a living. and who had just been informed 30 seconds in advance that he was about to speak in front of 300 people about something that lived in the part of him he didn't usually show in public. He went up anyway, because you did, because you showed up even when the conditions were imperfect. Because his father had shown up to 30 years of job sites and his wife had shown up to 47 pages of research, and the least he could do was walk to a low stage in a church on Auburn Avenue and say something true. He stood at the microphone. He looked at the room. Then he looked down at his wrist. He took the watch off, slowly. The way you took off something you'd been wearing for 8 years. It left a faint impression on his skin where it had been. "This was my father's," he said. The room was very still. James Webb. He was a contractor. Birmingham, Alabama. He built things with his hands for 30 years. Good work, work that held up. He turned the watch over once. He died when I was 28, prostate cancer. Stage 3 when they found it, because he'd spent 6 years not going to a doctor. Not because he didn't know better. Because every time he thought about it, he did the math, and the math didn't work. He looked up. I became a CPA because of that. Because I decided that if I could make numbers make sense, if I could keep the account straight and catch the errors before they compounded, I could prevent certain kinds of loss. He paused. That's not the worst reason to choose a profession, but it's also not the whole reason. The whole reason was that I was 28 years old and I was scared, and being good with numbers felt like a way to not be scared anymore. He looked at Simone. She was standing at the side of the room, still, watching him with an expression he was going to spend a long time afterward trying to describe and not finding the right words for. "My wife built this program without telling me," he said. "For 8 months, she wrote 47 pages of research at our kitchen table while I was asleep upstairs. She got rejected 8 times and kept going. She sat across from one of the most powerful men in this city with shaking hands and made him believe in something he'd never done before." He turned the watch in his palm once more. "And she didn't tell me, because years ago, after my father died, I said something careless about not wanting to hear about things without guaranteed outcomes. I said it once. I barely remembered saying it. She remembered every word for 8 years. The room was very still. That's the thing about the people who love you," he said. "They hear the things you say when you're scared and they try to protect you from your own limits, even when what you actually need is for someone to hand you a problem that's bigger than your limits and trust you to grow into it." He looked at the wall of photographs, at the man in the clinic chair, 65 maybe, reading something, just there. "My father deserved a program like this," he said. "He deserved the door that his own body couldn't give him access to because the money was never right, and he didn't get it. And I've carried that for 8 years in the shape of a watch that runs 4 minutes fast." He set the watch on the edge of the stage, gently, like setting something down that had been heavy. 247 people this year got something he didn't get. That's what this is, that's what she built. He stepped back. The room held a moment of silence that was not empty. Then Ebenezer Aim filled with sound. Afterward, in the parking lot, the crowd moved slowly. The kind of slow that happened after events that had given people something to sit with. People stopping each other, conversations extending, the night air still and cool. Duran was standing beside the car when Simone found him. She came straight to him across the parking lot, didn't stop to talk to anyone on the way. Just came and stood in front of him and put both hands on his face and looked at him. 8 years, she said. "I know. I kept that inside for 8 years, I know. 'Cause of one sentence you said." "Simone, I'm not angry," she said. "I just want you to understand what I carried." He looked at her, at the gold earrings, at the burgundy dress, at the woman who had written 47 pages at his kitchen table while he slept, and hadn't told him until he'd found out on his own. "I understand it," he said, "and I need you to understand that I'm not that man anymore." She looked at him. "I'm still careful," he said. "I'm still going to want the numbers to make sense, that's not changing. But careful isn't the same as closed. And I was closed, for a long time. I was closed and I called it being sensible." She lowered her hands from his face, took his hand instead. "So we're both different now," she said. "We're both different now. Good." She looked at the church, at Auburn Avenue, at the old trees and the amber light of the street lamps. "Because the 3-year expansion framework you built has a staffing section that needs work." He stared at her. "The projections in year 2 are optimistic," she said. "You know they're optimistic, they're achievable. With the right hire, they're achievable. Then we find the right hire." "We," she said. "We," he said. She started walking toward the car. He fell into step beside her. Their shoulders touched and stayed touching, the easy contact of people who knew how to occupy space together. He looked down at his wrist, no watch. The watch was on the edge of a stage inside Ebenezer Aim where he'd left it. He realized he'd have to go back for it. He didn't move to go back for it, not yet. For right now, his wrist was bare in the November air, light, a little strange. Like a door that had been closed so long you'd forgotten it was a door, and then it opened, and the feeling was not emptiness but possibility. They got in the car, he drove. She had her phone out and was already making notes on the staffing section. He drove down Auburn Avenue and then down MLK and then onto I-20 West toward Cascade Heights. Atlanta moved around them in its ordinary way. The lights, the traffic. The city going about its Saturday evening the way cities did, without ceremony, without acknowledgement of all the small irreversible things happening inside it. A woman deciding to write a proposal. A man deciding to stop protecting himself from uncertainty. 247 people who'd received something they shouldn't have had to fight for. The fig tree in the backyard would still be there when they got home. The kitchen table would be there. The documents would still be on it, the expansion framework, the staffing projections, all of it waiting for the next night of work. But first, the next morning, the Auburn Avenue clinic opened at 8. A man walked in at 8:04. He was 59 years old. He lived in Vine City. He had not been to a doctor in 11 years. Not because he didn't know better. Because every time he thought about it, he did the math. He sat down in the waiting room. The chairs were comfortable. The walls were painted a warm yellow. On the far wall, community photographs from Auburn Avenue across the decades. On the reception desk, a small vase of flowers. On a wooden plaque beside the entrance, a name. In memory of James Webb. Birmingham, Alabama. 1958 to 2018. The man did not know who James Webb was. He picked up the intake form from the desk. It was clear and simple. 3 pages. Someone had thought carefully about what to ask and how to ask it. Someone had thought carefully about how it felt to fill it out. There were no questions designed to make you prove you deserved to be there. He read it. He began to fill it out. His hand was steady. He folded it along the top crease the way his mother had taught him to treat important documents with care, as if the paper itself understood what it held. He sat back. He waited for his name to be called. For the first time in 11 years the math had worked.